Okay, so we're at the point now where we're going to dive in. Now that we've talked about the stereotypes, we're going to dive into the reasons that people do have a Mormon faith crisis. But before we do, I'm going to just ask all our listeners to do us a favor. Go to the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis Facebook page and like this page. Because if you do, that's going to help others learn about us. And if you're even willing, give us a positive review. It would really make a difference. And if you really value what we're doing so far, you want to see this continue, you're benefiting from it or want others to benefit from it, I'm going to give another plea for you to please consider making a monthly donation. Something as little as $10 a month. If we get enough people to do this, it'll pay for Natasha's time, Margi's time, my time, and it will make this podcast more sustainable. So far, we only have one donor, and we've had hundreds of listeners. So if a few of you would be willing to go to MormonFaithCrisis.com, click on, you can do mobile device or a web browser, click on the donate button at the top or the top right of the screen, select the amount that you want to contribute monthly. It would make a huge difference, not just for yourself and for us, but for generations to come, because we plan on just leaving this podcast up for free to help, people for generations. We just need your support to pay for the time. Okay, so
and the cost of the infrastructure, don't forget that. I mean, websites cost money and storage costs, all of that. So
and the editing and the production and the equipment and all that stuff. Yep, we need your support for. All right, so thanks so much to everyone so far. Let's dive in. Now, I've put together 5 main categories of some of the main causes of a faith crisis. And then there's some other factors that we're going to talk about afterwards. But let's talk about these main 5 categories. And we could talk about whether these apply to us individually, because we've all been through a faith crisis here as co-panelists. And we can also talk about clients or friends or people that we know as well. Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. Natasha, will you do the first one?
So the first one is there's people for whom the church never really resonated, or it ceased to resonate. And these people tend to often leave in their teen years, or maybe aren't allowed to leave, because of their parents and their structure, but are pretty much checked out. And as soon as they are adults, they kind of stop attending church.
Have you met people like this, Natasha?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And I think that I think it's one of the ways that it's unfortunate in our narrative in Mormonism, where we don't, when you have the narrative that we're the one and only true way, and that's the only way that you can really get to have a spiritual life. I think, unfortunately, we do a disservice by not honoring people like this. I would prefer in our tradition to have something along the ways of, well, we're sad that this doesn't resonate with you, and we love our way. But we sure hope and will support you in finding a way that resonates for you. We really don't have that kind of traditional capacity in Mormonism because we're so focused on being the one and only true church. Mm-hmm. So it's an either or. Either you're in or you're not, and then there's really not much conversation happening in the in-betweens.
And these people, for me, most of the clients, and you guys tell me if you have different experiences, most of the clients that I deal with are people that were Orthodox Mormons into their 30s and 40s and 50s, and they were really, really invested and committed to the church.
Yes.
And then every once in a while, I'll stumble on somebody, they're like, I never really bought any of that. I knew when I was 15 that it wasn't true. And I had to wait until I got out of the home, or I just told my parents, I'm not going. And they stopped, they figured it out for them as teenagers, and they never really allowed themselves to get too invested. And a lot of these people are the ones who report the least harm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they need the less support, because it's just
they leave.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I went to a local community college, or I went to a state school, and I
found new friends and
had healthy sexual developmental experiences, and not always, but sometimes, or they learned to consume adult beverages responsibly, and they got married at the age that felt right to them, and had the number of kids that they wanted to, and follow the career that they wanted to. Now, of course, not everybody who leaves Mormonism in their teens has a great experience. Some have catastrophic experiences and in the middle. But for the most part, these are, for me, the people that don't end up needing a lot of coaching about their faith crisis.
And what's interesting for me about this, and I actually think I have some experience with this category myself, but I would say is that many of them are internal, because what they've gone through is this, they know what doesn't resonate. They're having an experience going through the church things of saying, wait, I'm not sure if that, as opposed to, and I think that's why when they leave on some level, they have this connection with themselves that they take with them, as they go. Now, I would say for me, because my testimony, and we got into this a little bit with my interview with Mormon Transitions, was a very practical one. It wasn't quite, I wouldn't say it was doctrinal or necessarily belief-based at the core, because it was practical. Some things, structurally changed in our marriage, where you came to me, I read some books. But what I experienced, and here's an example, is I would go to church, and when I was at church, the things that I was fed, or the,
Okay, wait, can I clarify something?
Yes.
Are you now speaking about the second sort of subcategory in this bullet, which is when things cease to resonate? Okay, I just want to make sure. So the first sort of subcategory in this bullet was people that just as teens figured out. Now you're talking about people that over time, something just doesn't, it starts to feel disharmonious for you. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead, keep going. Okay.
Yes, so it ceased to resonate. I think this is also quite common to people amidst their transition process. This can be part of it. So I'm going to church like I always did, but all of a sudden my experience at church is different.
Got it.
So I'm no longer feeling fed by the things that are being said. I'm not feeling uplifted or inspired. And to counter that, I am experiencing that as I'm reading on my own, or I'm doing yoga on my own, or I'm reading Buddhism on my own, that I'm having this relationship with other food that's outside the paradigm that's really enhancing my life. So now I have this disparity of when I go, I'm really not having a positive, productive, life-enhancing experience. That's an example of something ceasing to resonate at church. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah.
In your experience?
Yeah, it's just, and then some would even say like it got boring, or I found like I was working all the time and giving my whole life to the church, and my family was suffering, or my own mental health, or some people, like, they start living the Mormon dream, and they get married young and forgo a career and have a bunch of kids, and then they realize they're miserable, and they're like, well, this is the great plan of happiness, I'm not happy, it's not working. And so for those reasons, or it just gets boring.
It can be agitating, it can be depleting. You get done and you actually feel exhausted for the rest of the day as well.
Totally. And you just find out it's just depleting you. In other words, it's not always historical stuff. It's not always social justice stuff. It's not always abuse. Sometimes it's just either when you're young or when you're middle-aged or whatever, it just stops working for you. Anything you want to add to that, Natasha?
Yeah, I would say the people that I've seen more in my practice that present in either of these categories present, the younger ones, right, that kind of leave on their own. Usually they're not seeking my services, when they're 18 or 19. If that's happening, it's because their parents are wanting them to come, right? In some regards, if the parents are concerned. But people might show up later for one of two reasons that I see, that, that they might present kind of like, yeah, I left when I was 18 and never really looked back. But now, I'm in my 40s and I'm realizing that there was a lot of damage there done in my family relationships. And so either there were breakoffs or cutoffs that happened, unfortunately, because the family wasn't able to accept their leaving, or maybe not that drastic, but they still feel like there's some wedges there that they'd like to work on. And so they look to find somebody to work with them who's culturally competent, right, in Mormonism. The other reason why sometimes I see it still coming up is even though they didn't buy into it, there's still messages that didn't necessarily escape. So especially as being a sex therapist, they still feel like a lot of sexual shame or kind of the rhetoric that they grew up with around their sexuality, even though they maybe don't buy into it intellectually, still presents in their sexual life. And so they're like, what impact did growing up in this kind of, more Orthodox or Mormon tradition have on my sexuality? And I'm ready to kind of look at that more in depth and want to work on that. So those are kind of typically, now the people who it stops resonating for, kind of like you, Margi, if that had happened to you without John's, impetus, right, of his own issues that he was presenting to you, then that can present as, of course, many mixed faith marriages where there's an issue for one but not the other, and so then of course there's distress in that regard as well.
So can I say one last thing?
Yeah.
With regard to resonance? Another way resonance, I feel like, can come up is in identity. And if you have this experience of, starting to find enrichment outside, for example, your church experience, and then you're having growth, but it's outside a traditional church model, right? Then what happens is, so the first idea of resonance is during church, right? You're having this experience, and on Sundays, you're really exhausted. But the second way is identity. It's that I started not resonating with the identity and values of the church. So that took place over time as I was growing sort of outside, seeking my own sources, being fed in ways that actually did resonate. Then what happened was I started not resonating with the values of the church in my everyday life. I started feeling less connected. Does that make sense? So it hit me eventually in an identity way where I just felt like, actually, my values are different now. Now I just feel like I'm not resonating with the people who go. Now I'm feeling isolated. I'm feeling very different in my experience. And that's another way and another sort of level of not feeling resonance as well.
Yeah. Love it. And there are some comments that are really resonating. Jamie writes, the catalyst for my faith crisis was actually the 2016 election. Now, Mormon Faith Crisis podcast does not have a political affiliation. We want to be safe for Republicans, Democrats, independents, non-US political people, communists, whatever it is, fascists, like, please know I'm going to give that disclaimer because sometimes people feel strongly about politics. And I just want to say we're neutral about that, but we're also going to honor people's own experiences. So for Jamie, he writes, he had a faith crisis after the 2016 election. From his perspective, he saw hypocrisy from people that claim to be followers of Christ. And Christ's teachings about taking care of the needy, especially refugees and immigrants. To him, it made zero sense that people who he worshiped with would speak ill against immigrants or refugees or people that were in need. So he says he started to pull away, found groups on Facebook with more nuanced views, and that's where he was introduced into a culture of questioning and critical thinking. And then he jumped down the rabbit hole from there. And the point there is just that, and this is true, and this is actually supported by data, a lot of people leave religious traditions, conservative religious traditions, because the conservative religious traditions become overly identified with one area on the political spectrum. And Mormons typically are conservative Republicans, at least in the United States. And so Jamie's experience is a common reason. If you tend to be politically liberal or become politically liberal, and you're always hearing conservative Republican sort of rhetoric at church, that can be something that is an impetus.
Yeah.
And that affects your lived experience. So I just want to thank Jamie for sharing that. There are a couple others that are interesting as well. Let's see. M writes, as an Army officer, I met so many different kinds of people. No, I'm gonna mention that later. So I'm gonna pause on that. Jamie writes, I found my membership in the church stifled relationships more than expanded them. And that's important. It's just basically, she was just starting to feel like the Mormon chains or the Mormon rules were not leading to edifying, expanding, growing relationships. And that's how it was for Jamie. That's not how it is for all Mormons, obviously. Yeah. So that's important. Anyway, so these are some of your feedback, and it's great. So please keep the feedback coming. All right, so that's and the final thing I'll just say about this is, it's really probably hard for an Orthodox believing Mormon to entertain the idea that someone outgrew Mormonism, that it was actually spiritual growth or personal development that led them out. Because how can this be God's one true church, you know, the one true church with all the right commandments and all the right rules, and then somebody outgrows it? So I'm just going to empathize with the Orthodox believing Mormon that's going to possibly find this idea ridiculous. Having said that, you're probably never going to hear ever in the next, you probably have never heard in the past and will not hear for decades, somebody across the pulpit speak about someone leaving the church and becoming a better person. And that's just how groups work. It's not that Mormonism's evil per se. It's just that people tend to feel like they're in the best group and that the best people come out of the group they're in. And so a lot of people are just going to, or some people are going to say, I prayed and God told me to leave Mormonism. And Mormons are going to just automatically go, well, that was Satan. You were deceived. But I have met people who said, I felt spiritually led to leave Mormonism. And I think regardless of where you are in the church or out of the church, it would be healthy to leave space for that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it goes back to your initial, when we started with you drinking coffee.
Right.
It's like, you know, because even that language of outgrowing Mormonism, I don't, for some people that is the case. Mormonism is limiting to their spiritual growth, but that does not apply to everybody. That doesn't mean that everybody is limited by Mormonism, right? So there are people that have tremendous spiritual growth within a Mormon construct. So this really is a for me moment, right? I like to use the for me strategy a lot. So when we use this language, we're just wanting to try to make room for everybody's experience.
That's right. I love that.
Love it.
Keep us on that, Natasha.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If other people want to share their comments about what caused them to leave, I want to hear it. Now, we're doing something really cool right now. We actually added a bullet to our list because of an awesome comment that a few people made. So it is now time for the second of 5, the second of 6 instead of the second of 5 reasons. I'm going to add reason number 2 for people leaving the church is exposure to awesome non-Mormons. And this comes from a comment. This is something that I've known in the past. I've written about this in the past, but in my haste to put together the notes, I didn't list it. But this comes from M, who writes, as an Army officer, I met so many different kinds of people from different backgrounds. They were good people without the one true church. That is a very common thing that causes a faith crisis. And then Jamie went on to write, something similar. Again, she found her membership stifled her relationship. So anyway, the point is, and I got this at Microsoft. I go to Microsoft and all of a sudden I meet Sikhs and I meet Orthodox Jews and I meet Hindus. And these people are moral. They're faithful to their spouse if they're married. They have their own health code that works for them. They're honest. Sometimes they have more integrity than I do. And I'm like, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense. So there could be really smart, moral, incredible non-Mormons. And that leads you to think, why am I Mormon? Well, I'm probably Mormon because my parents were Mormon and they taught me to be Mormon. Maybe they're Hindu because their parents taught them to be Hindu. What if we're all part of this wonderful chorus of good people and bad people, but we can't overly correlate your religious upbringing with the caliber of the person.
Well, it's so funny to me how I always like to tease our own Mormonism as being somewhat narcissistic, right? Because we totally talk about this on the other end. So we are the ones that are going to influence people, right? You met that cool Mormon family and, they walked into your home and they felt the spirit and they saw, the family proclamation, I guess, on the wall or whatever it is. And so we take pride in that as Mormons, right? That we're going to shine a light and we're going to have an influence on other people because of how we live our lives. And if we have lives that are full of light, then people will be attracted to that and they'll ask questions. And these are the ways that we talked about missionary moments. Well, guess what? We also have those experiences with other people who shine light. And so we're not the only one. We're not like the, beholders of light. So I think sometimes these same things we talk about and have language for, but only on one side of the lived experience.
Love it.
So true. I think too, it really speaks to the power of relationships in our lives and connection as well. I feel like proximity to, having relationships with people with a lot of differing opinions or diverse beliefs, or I feel like allows for us to have experiences that make us, able to hold a lot of different things that might be opposing together. And I think it adds a level of depth, if you will. I definitely had that experience growing up on the East Coast in places where, Mormonism was not the prevalent religion of choice. And also, I think having relatives, none of my relatives were Mormon. And so you do have this appreciation that they're good people everywhere, and that you love people, you cherish people, you're inspired by people who are actually different than you.
Yeah.
You may not even want to believe what they believe, but you're still inspired by it. And it produces this very rich landscape.
Yeah. For sure.
We're getting some great comments from our viewers. Teresa says, great point, Natasha. A lot of people are resonating with your point about the tendency towards any group, including Mormons, to be a little bit prideful and arrogant. M writes, Natasha's so right. I feel like I was so arrogant as a Mormon. Now I am more humble and I listen to others. Yes, and as Natasha likes to say, we do not want believing Orthodox Mormons listening to this podcast to think that we're saying that Mormons are just arrogant. This is every organization, every religion, every group. Even atheists and agnostics can be arrogant and insufferable, right? Or sometimes especially atheists and agnostics. So
and post-Mormons.
Yeah, post-Mormons. So any group thinks they're better than the other group. That's just human nature until you get a more global perspective. That's why Mark Twain once said something like travel is fatal to prejudice. If you travel around the world enough, you're going to realize that there are just a lot of great people out there and a lot of bad people out there. So everyone's loving your comment, Natasha.
Thank you.
Mark writes, I've been fortunate to have not grown up in Utah. I've known better, more ethical atheists than even myself as active LDS. Great point, Mark. So often we think it's such a common reaction when somebody has a faith crisis. It's like, well, if you don't believe in God and Jesus anymore, why don't you just stab and kill your wife and rape people and rob banks because we're in a certain mindset, we just can't even imagine that they're actually ethical, moral, healthy atheists or agnostics or non-religious people. But there are a ton of them.
Right.
Mark calls it tribalism, and that's a great point, Mark. It's tribalism. Jana says, John, you are a lucky podcaster to have two intelligent women with you today. Thanks, Jana. And there are more because we have 42 listeners, about half are women or more. So Jana, you're one of those intelligent, thoughtful women with us. All right. I think there are a couple other comments here. Lisa writes, I had a hard time sitting in Relief Society as a single adult, being taught about being a mother or how to teach your children. It made me feel I didn't fit in. Okay, we're going to get to that, Lisa. That is a great point.
That's actually our next point.
Is that our next point?
That is.
Okay, so Margi, is it Margi or Natasha's turn?
Not mine.
I think it's Margi. So Margi,
Yep.
What is the third main category or reason that people have a Mormon faith crisis?
Yeah, so that would be people that don't fit within traditional Mormon culture. So minorities, feminists, LGBTQ, intellectual people, people of color, millennials, people who are single or divorced. So basically anyone.
Now, what do you mean they don't fit in? Does that mean a feminist can't ever feel like they fit in Mormonism? What do you mean?
To me, it feels like anyone outside the template, right? The kind of the audience.
Ideal.
Yeah, or the ideal.
So the church advances an ideal, and there are some people within these categories that feel like they
are less than or don't fit in the mold or actually aren't included in the audience that oftentimes is being talked to
So
in meetings or, you know.
So let's do some examples. So Natasha, Margi, give me an example of how a feminist might feel uncomfortable at church.
Well, I mean, it's the lived experience of, just completely being excluded from any type of, well, I don't want to be too black and white, but for really at some level, you are always answering to a man, right? So the administrative power and decision-making is always going to be deferred to as a man. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have any power or any decision-making abilities as women within Mormonism. I mean, obviously there's a lot of callings that women, spend a lot of time in and develop their own leadership skills and do all kinds of interesting things within Mormonism. And I do actually, back to the other last week's podcast, that's one of the things I'm grateful for about my Mormonism is that I feel like it did develop my leadership and speaking skills in many ways that I wouldn't have maybe otherwise been able to have. And at the same time, I've been in many frustrating situations where my authority, for example, as a mental health practitioner, my authority as a sexologist, my authority as a mother, my authority just in my lived experience, even as a visiting teacher or as the Relief Society president was always, it was always deferred under a male authority figure. So my word could never be the last word. My authority was never as good. And then of course you have all the lived experiences where, I had my young daughter, asking me from a very early age, why aren't there any girls passing the sacrament, for example? Why can't I have the priesthood? What, so these things that were,
why are there no women
me,
prophets?
slapping me in the face.
They're not on the pulpit anywhere.
They're not on the pulpit.
It's a man that's always interviewing a woman to decide if she's worthy for various things.
Yeah. I mean, it just becomes, once you start understanding feminist theory, which of course I started understanding that at BYU in my women's studies class, it was shocking, all the things I had never noticed before, because when you're the fish in the water, it's hard to know what water feels like, right? So it's hard sometimes. And I remember getting very angry as a strong, what I considered feminist Mormon woman, to be told that I was not feminist enough, right? Or that I did not believe in equality but at the same time, as I started studying it more, I had to, see the biases and see kind of how other people perceive us and then see myself through that lens. And yeah, it's hard.
Another way this comes up oftentimes is just choices. So when you have a formula, which definitely exists within the church for females in particular, then what happens is, your dreams, like this idea that there are many choices, you don't feel that anymore. You feel like there's this certain ideal formula that you have to live. And if you are outside that and you want a job or you feel super ambitious and then you feel
if you don't want kids, if you don't want to get married young,
like there are a million things.
You want to have a career.
Right. And this came up for me, ironically, not for myself first. It came up in young women's when I was teaching. And what I found was I felt really uncomfortable teaching certain lessons.
Like marry young, don't worry about your education.
Right. So for like a decade, I literally taught my own young women's lessons in young women as a young women leader. And that's how it came up for me. And then it was for my daughters. And I saw those things first before I actually was able to see it for myself.
Well, and I didn't see it at the time, but I see it now. I didn't go to medical school because I wanted, that felt too difficult to be a mom and go to medical school. I told my sister not to go to medical school. She's now a child and adolescent psychiatrist and a mother. But my elderly sisterly advice was to not do that. I mean, that's just, when I think about those implications for my life and the life of those I love, they're huge.
Right.
Huge.
And I want to always do disclaimers so that everyone feels welcome on this podcast. Not every Mormon woman is a feminist, and not everyone agrees with feminist theology, and that's fine. It's one way to look at the world, and so not everyone agrees or feels the same things that Mormon feminists feel, and not all feminists feel uncomfortable at the church. There are feminists that go to church and are fine with men having more sort of decision-making abilities than women. So we don't want to say that all Mormons are feminists, or that all should be, or that even all feminists are uncomfortable. We're just trying to speak
Give
to a
some
larger point,
examples.
which is that there's some people that don't feel like they fit in.
That's right.
Now, for the purpose of just time, we're gonna play a quick game called Empathize with the Marginalized Group, and I'm just gonna ask you guys in a brief way to illustrate an example of how this marginalized group might not feel comfortable, but keep it really brief. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And either of you could jump in. So an LGBTQ person, who wants to go?
Well, this was right away in my practice as a burgeoning therapist, having gay members, lesbian members have really no place.
Just give a brief, one sentence
Mixed orientation marriage, where I started realizing how many people got married heterosexually because there was really no other option, and the devastation that created for everybody in that family system.
Who they are is wrong. Who they are, it's like the behavior isn't the problem, but who you are, like, basically is the way you're made. It's faulty.
Right.
It's wrong. You can't have intimacy in the way that you desire intimacy and be worthy.
Yeah, that your attractions are evil.
Yeah.
That you
Self-shame. It's shame.
Who you choose to love is evil. Even sometimes Mormons get carried away and say that gay, lesbian, same-sex marriage is a sign of the times, that it's a sign of wickedness.
Mm-hmm.
All of these sorts of messages, worthiness interviews, etc., can make an LGBTQ person feel like they don't belong, or like church is damaging to them.
Yes.
Okay, how about intellectuals? Who wants to go on that? That's not to say that there aren't smart people who are Mormon that are Orthodox and faithful, but what's an example of how a thinky person can feel uncomfortable at church?
They're prideful. I'd say that's a term that's used a lot, that their desire to know or to figure things out is somehow an issue of character. They're prideful. They're not humble enough.
And it's such a catch-22 because we're encouraged to be truth seekers, right? We're encouraged to get our educations. We're encouraged to, find the truth. And then when we do that and it kind of has a tension within the narrative at church, then again, you're back to one of those victim blaming situations, and feel unwelcome.
But yeah, and for me, it would be warnings about anti-Mormon literature, warnings about people who have left the church, warnings about, learning too much or staying away from certain books, or certain questions are bad, or
actually being educated, being too learned.
Yeah. Even criticizing science or educated people. There are scenarios within Mormon culture where people who have questions or doubts or thoughts, or people who love science, people who really value evolution, people who think the earth is billions of years old, not thousands of years old, people who question the literalness of Adam and Eve and a global flood. These are examples of ways intellectual people can feel marginalized or like they don't.
Well, and the field of psychology is huge in this. We have a very conflicted relationship with psychology within Mormonism. And even currently, some of the rhetoric is very concerning to me. What I'm hearing about revelation is more important than learned truth, which really, I think, is an attack on a lot of the psychological best treatments and standards of care when it comes to populations such as LGBTQ plus and, sexual concerns and things of that nature. It's like, don't trust the science. Don't trust the intellectuals. Don't trust the people who've gotten their degrees in this. Revelation is where you need to put your trust.
Love it. Okay, none of us are people of color, but let's make sure and include them. How might a person of color feel uncomfortable within Mormonism? Go.
It's so fraught.
Just brief.
You came from a bad background, even in the pre-existence. Like, you were a fence sitter, and your color and your race is the fact that you showed up here on this world as a person of color already means that you're starting off behind the rest of us.
You're cursed.
You're cursed. Did you read the Book of Mormon? You read about the Lamanites, that they were cursed with dark skin for wickedness.
So shame, because your color then reinforces this idea that you were cursed and set apart.
So then you're treated in this weird way, like you're really special because you're a part of us.
But let me touch your hair because your hair.
But you're not really. But you're probably not special enough for me to want my white kid to marry you, right? Or to date you, or or to have the calling maybe that we don't see people of color in our leadership at all, hardly. I mean, it's laughable,
And you never see people who represent you in the leadership, right?
No, right.
Okay. How about millennials? Why are millennials leaving church at such a fast rate? Younger people.
Well, I think a big part of younger people is information. They're a big part of the information age. And when you say to people who their core value is truth and information, oh, don't pay attention to information, instead pay attention to this revelation that us older people are going to tell you what to do, that totally doesn't resonate with their values, their authenticity, their sense of self, their goals. They probably see that as immoral, quite frankly.
Yeah, and I view their connection with social conscious, kind of, whether that's the environment, whether that's with, LGBTQ,
feminism,
whatever,
all of those
equality.
it's viewed as like kind of silly or misguided
By the church.
or by the church, as opposed to something that they would want to see as being really
noble and valiant.
absolutely.
And,
compassionate and conscientious. And
they're more progressive.
It's the generational model, right? I mean, most of the time the younger generation thinks that the rest of us are outdated and old fashioned, and they're moving ahead with or without us.
That's right.
So, and we've made it pretty clear we're not interested in moving with them.
Okay, Natasha, how about single or divorced people? Can you speak for them?
Well, back to what Margi said, when the narrative doesn't include them, when the ideal is always this idealized family, kind of 1950s white American white picket fence type of reality that actually is not the reality at all. I mean, when you look at the statistics of how many people fit into that reality, when you look at how many grandparents or guardians are raising children, single parents, people who never marry, people who raise foster kids, I mean, we are talking to a very small amount of the population, and yet raising that ideal. So when you go to church and constantly feel like, you're being faced with the idea that the way you've set up your life is subpar, that's harmful. Who wants
the way your life ended up
who wants to be reminded of that week after week, and then, so people leave just because they don't feel comfortable. I mean, there's lots of people who believe, who have testimonies, but who don't attend church because they feel, like I don't fit.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some people that turns into a faith transition when they actually say, wait a minute, why am I buying into this narrative to begin with? I'm fine the way I am. Our family is fine the way it is. We don't have to be this, dad, mom, 3 or 4 kids in tow. Maybe we're a blended family. Maybe we're a single parent. All those, we're fine.
Yeah. Rachel writes, I chose to marry a non-member.
Mm-hmm.
So she certainly didn't fit in. And thank you, Rachel, for sharing. That's another one. If you're married to a non-member, what's your celestial kingdom going to look like? Who are your kids sealed to? To what extent are you always showing up to church alone, or people are awkwardly trying to baptize or convert your spouse? Like all those things, all those combinations of marital status or single status can definitely be problematic for people. Yeah. I've heard being single in the church can be hell.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. What I want to say, I guess, as we close out this point, which is very concerning to me as a mental health professional, is that when the tension between what the church is espousing as a healthy, happy life is in so many areas in contrast with what we actually have researched, best quality of care, best lifestyles. We know a lot about healthy marriages. We know a lot about healthy self-care. We know a lot about how boundaries and all these kinds of things can help people have good quality of life. So what the church is saying, here's the equation for happy life, and what best care standards of practice are saying, here's the equation for happy life. When there's such a strong tension between those things, that's highly concerning to me, specifically with gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer members, specifically for women, specifically for gender roles, and how both men and women are affected by that and limited by that greatly, how we espouse parenting kind of expectations, expectations about when to marry, who to marry, when to marry, sexual expectations. I mean, so many things are actually not aligned with good quality of life and mental health. And that's very distressing to me as a member myself.
Absolutely. I love it. One last category in this sub-bullet is liberals. We already mentioned them, but oftentimes Democrats and liberals, if they're in a conservative ward, don't feel welcome.
I've definitely felt that. I had to listen to the, oh, I'm so glad Bush is in office because, you know, the Antichrist Clinton now is out. I mean, I'm just like, I did not come to church to listen to crap like that. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to hear Obama's the savior either. I tried attending a Unitarian church once, and I kind of am turned off by a discussion of politics in a religious setting. That's just me. I don't want to hear it on either side. That's just how I feel.
Yeah, and I think that's a difference sometimes between politics and social justice. I know that there are many churches that are very happy to talk about social justice issues, and those, of course, can get conflated very quickly. I do think that there is a role for church to talk about social justice, and maybe part of why we're uncomfortable with that, John, is because we've never actually contributed to social justice discussions, quite frankly, in Mormonism. We're not used to that.
Absolutely, that can be true for a lot of people. And by the way, I love talks about social justice, and I feel very committed to it. I just don't like it mixed in my religion. It feels, if it gets too political, it feels, I don't know, maybe it's just conditioning, how I'm raised. But that's just how I feel.
It's good to know yourself.
Yeah. Maybe I need to grow. Maybe I need to get more comfortable.